We would like to offer a special thanks to BarkBox for supporting The Trail Went Cold. BarkBox is a subscription service that delivers a selection of treats and toys for your dog right to your door each month. For a free extra month of BarkBox, go to barkbox.com/cold when you subscribe to a 6 or 12-month plan. That's barkbox.com/cold. Thank you and enjoy the show. February 14th, 2006. Pahrump, Nevada. 41-year-old Maureen Fields shows up to work at her bank and expresses concern that something is going to happen to her. The following day, Maureen fails to show up for work, and her husband, Paul Fields, claims he last saw her when she left the house that morning. Maureen's abandoned car is discovered in the desert, along with many of her personal items, but she is nowhere to be found, and suspicion is directed towards her husband. Years later, DNA evidence from the scene is matched to a convicted sex offender named Keith Wayne Holmes, but because he is suffering from dementia, he is unable to provide concrete answers about what happened, and soon passes away. After that, the trail went cold. Happy Valentine's Day, everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host, Robin Warder, and since the official date of this episode's release is February 14th, I thought I'd feature not one, but two cases which occurred on Valentine's Day. As you probably know, this podcast is no longer releasing minisodes, but there are a lot of cases I still want to cover which just don't have enough material for a full-length episode. So our best solution for that is to do double feature episodes like this one, which will cover two separate mysteries which have a similar theme to them. On this particular episode, both these cases happen to take place on Valentine's Day. Our first story will be the unsolved 2006 disappearance of a woman named Maureen Fields. This is one of those missing persons cases where on the surface, it seems pretty obvious that the husband is responsible, but to the surprise of everyone, DNA evidence was matched to another suspect. But since this suspect was no longer lucid enough to provide a coherent explanation, this development only opened up more questions than answers. Our second story will be the 2007 murder of a woman named Jodine Serrin, which was actually requested by a listener named Kelly, so thank you very much, Kelly. But I gotta tell you up front, this is one of the most horrific crimes I've ever featured on this podcast, as the victim was a vulnerable young woman with a mental disability, and without even realizing it at the time, her father had to witness the killer do unthinkable things to her body. As disturbing as this story is, it deserves to be profiled because this is one perpetrator who really needs to get caught. However, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of these sites because that will help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on the website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now start off with the first of our two stories, the disappearance of Maureen Fields. Our story begins in the unincorporated desert town of Pahrump, Nevada in 2006. Our central figure is 41-year-old Maureen Fields, who lives with her 56-year-old husband, Paul Fields. The couple have been married nearly 15 years and originally hail from New Jersey. They have lived in Pahrump for 10 months, and Maureen now works as a bank teller at the local Wells Fargo branch. On Valentine's Day, Maureen showed up to work at the bank, but both her co-workers and customers noticed that she seemed very perturbed. At various points throughout the day, Maureen would break out into tears, but would not go into any specifics about what was bothering her, only stating, "Something's going to happen." When one of her colleagues asked if she was going to have a good Valentine's Day, Maureen replied, "No." Maureen never did share what was wrong, and when she left the bank at the end of her shift that day, it would turn out to be the last time she was confirmed to be alive. The following morning, Maureen was supposed to show up for work at 8:30 a.m., but never arrived. After 20 minutes passed, her co-workers decided to phone Maureen's husband Paul at home. Paul claimed that Maureen had left the house at 8 a.m. to drive to work, and he didn't have any idea where she was. However, he said that he was going to go to the police station and file a missing persons report on her. Well, Paul did go to the police that morning, but the only thing he did was inquire about whether or not there had been any reported accidents involving a green 2004 Hyundai, which was the vehicle Maureen drove. When the police told him no, Paul left the station. He would later claim that he attempted to report Maureen missing, but was told he'd have to wait at least 24 hours. However, the deputy on duty said that Paul never actually mentioned anything about his wife at all. The following day, Maureen's green Hyundai was discovered abandoned across the state line in the Mojave Desert in Inyo County, California, parked nearly 120 feet from the highway. The location was over 20 miles away from Pahrump and in close proximity to Death Valley. The keys were still in the vehicle's ignition, the driver's seat was fully reclined, and Maureen's purse, still containing her wallet and credit cards, had been left behind. There were numerous items inside the vehicle, including a pair of knotted pantyhose, some religious pamphlets, and Maureen's eyeglasses and slippers, which were underneath the gas pedal. There was also a .22 caliber rifle in the back seat, along with multiple bottles of prescription painkillers, including one bottle of Xanax, which happened to be empty. On the ground outside the vehicle, there was a blanket with very small traces of blood and vomit on it. However, an extensive search of the surrounding desert turned up no trace of Maureen. Initially, there was speculation that Maureen might have wandered off into the desert and committed suicide by overdosing on the pills from the empty Xanax bottle. But this theory was shot down once it was discovered that the bottle had been completely wiped clean of fingerprints. In addition, there was unidentified male DNA on the knotted pantyhose, so fear began to set in that Maureen was a victim of foul play. Well, suspicion immediately turned towards Paul Fields, who claimed he last saw Maureen when she left for work on the morning of February 15th. He said they got into an argument before she left, and the last words she said to him were, "I might as well do it now, why wait?" According to Paul, the argument had stemmed from him turning down sex with her the night before. But no one could be certain if Paul's story was true, as the last people besides him who could confirm seeing Maureen alive were her co-workers who saw her leave the bank on Valentine's Day. According to Maureen's family and friends, her marriage to Paul was not in good shape at that point, and she was looking for a divorce. He was known for being a jealous, domineering husband, and even though Maureen claimed Paul had never crossed the line into physical abuse, she appeared to be afraid of him, and had even said, "If I ever disappear, tell police Paul did it." Before he met Maureen, Paul had a previous divorce under his belt and was estranged from his 2 daughters. According to Paul's ex-wife, whenever she denied him visitation with his daughters after he missed child support payments, she would soon find her windshield smashed, her tires slashed. While Paul denied harming Maureen, and seemed certain that she had deliberately abandoned her car in the desert and orchestrated her own disappearance. He claimed that Maureen had been draining money from their joint bank accounts because of a gambling problem, and had withdrawn $2,000 and taken $7,000 cash advances off their credit cards before she went missing. When police checked their financial records, they discovered that in actuality, Maureen had taken a $4,000 advance off one of her credit cards, but used the money to pay off the balance on another card. The one thing which made Maureen's family and friends most skeptical about her disappearing voluntarily was the fact that she left behind her pet pit bull dog, Wolfie, whom she absolutely adored, and no one believed she ever would have taken off without Wolfie. Paul's alibi for Valentine's Day was that he went out to dinner with a friend, brought home food for Maureen, and then spent the rest of the evening watching television without leaving his mobile home. However, police checked Paul's cell phone records from that night, and saw that he had made a call to an acquaintance which pinged off a cell phone tower. The location of this tower seemed to suggest that Paul would have had to be on the other side of town in order to make this call. When questioned by police, There were numerous details about Paul's story which would change. As you'll recall, a .22 caliber rifle had been found in the back of Maureen's Hyundai, and when asked by police if any weapons were missing from his home, Paul checked his closet and expressed surprise that a .22 caliber rifle was missing. However, in an interview years later, Paul claimed that he had given the rifle to Maureen to take to a gun shop in order to get an estimate on how much it would cost to repair, which seemed to go against his surprised reaction over the rifle not being in the closet. Anyway, after the mandatory 90-day waiting period following Maureen's disappearance, Paul immediately went to court to try and get her name taken off their jointly owned land, and was met with resistance from Maureen's family. Paul was finally able to have Maureen declared legally dead in 2009 and became executor of her estate, though it's generally standard practice for a person to be missing 7 years before they're declared dead in absentia. The police openly considered Paul to be the prime suspect and attempted to file charges against him for Maureen's disappearance, but the local district attorney's office felt that the evidence was insufficient. Paul continued to maintain his innocence, and the investigation would eventually take a very surprising turn. In 2012, there was finally a match on the unidentified male DNA found on the knotted pantyhose inside Maureen's car. It was linked to an 81-year-old registered sex offender named Keith Wayne Holmes, who was incarcerated for trying to lure a 12-year-old girl into his car in Pear Blossom, California. When he was arrested for the incident in June of 2011, a newspaper clipping of an anniversary article about Maureen's disappearance was found under a mattress in his 1965 Ford camper. At that time, Holmes already had numerous sexual offenses on his record, and he also apparently had a history of picking up sex workers, beating them up, and abandoning them by the side of the road. While Pear Blossom was over 200 miles away from Pahrump, investigators did uncover evidence that Holmes was in the Pahrump area in 2006. Witnesses remembered Holmes frequenting local campgrounds during this time period in his Ford camper, as he was known for singing church music around the campfire. When investigators questioned Holmes, he admitted to knowing Maureen and explained the DNA evidence by claiming they had consensual sex together, but he denied harming Maureen and claimed that he left her alive in Death Valley before they went their separate ways. When asked about Paul Fields, Holmes claimed that he did know him, but wouldn't provide any further details. Well, needless to say, no one believed the consensual sex story, but there were other major issues with questioning Holmes to begin with. By this point, Holmes was suffering from dementia, and while police continued to question him on multiple occasions, he became less and less lucid. It eventually reached the point where Holmes would confess to such crimes as the murders of his mother and his wife, and he started believing that one of the detectives was his son. The final time Holmes was questioned, he was in a prison hospice bed, and when asked if he knew Paul Fields, he answered, "I think so." But when asked if he remembered how he knew Paul, Holmes simply replied, "No." In the end, Holmes could not provide any conclusive answers about what happened to Maureen, and he died in April of 2014. Paul denied knowing Holmes, and obviously, the statements of a suspect with dementia could hardly be considered concrete evidence against him. However, in spite of the DNA match to Holmes, investigators have made it clear that they have not eliminated Paul as a suspect. But unfortunately, there are still no answers about what actually happened to Maureen, and her body has never been found. So I guess you can say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our new sponsor, BarkBox, for supporting our podcast. BarkBox is a subscription service that delivers a selection of treats and toys for your dog right to your door each month. It is a new and exciting way to gift friends or family members who own a dog. All you have to do is tell BarkBox how big your dog is and choose a monthly plan subscription, which you may cancel at any time. Every month, BarkBox paw picks the best all-natural treats and innovative toys to match a dog's unique needs, including allergies and heavy chewer preferences. It's a great way to try a variety of treats and toys from local and small businesses that you may not otherwise be able to find. Each gift subscription includes toys and treats in a unique theme every month with different selections like Country Fair, Bark Ball, and Pooh York City. They offer new and unique toys which will continue to keep dogs engaged, interested, and happy. All edibles are made in the USA or Canada. You'll also receive free shipping on any BarkBox within the continental US. When your dog falls in love with something from the box, you can easily reorder it again on barkshop.com or the BarkBox app. BarkBox will also replace any items your dog doesn't like from the box, Scout's Honor, and send you something else for free. Anyway, I can tell you that one very satisfied customer of this service was McGill's mom and her Boston Terrier, Lola, who recently received our BarkBox. It was the What Dino is Your Dog dinosaur-themed box, full of treats and toys. Lola especially loved the pork roll, as well as the woolly mammoth and pterodactyl toys. McGill's mother was so impressed with the contents of the BarkBox, as well as the service itself, that she's planning on signing up using our special promo URL. Really, all you need to do is give the gift that keeps on giving, and make somebody's lucky pup the happiest pooch on the block. I can guarantee that your dog will be so happy that they'll be wagging their tail with excitement. So if you don't jump all over this, we might have to change the title of this podcast to The Tail Went Cold. So to take advantage of the Trail Went Cold special offer, just visit barkbox.com/cold for a free extra month of BarkBox every month when you subscribe to a 6 or 12-month plan. That's barkbox.com/cold. barkbox.com/cold. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of the show. So on the surface, this seemed like yet another one of those tragic spousal disappearances where the only possible resolution would be, the husband did it. I've seen far too many stories like this where a husband will claim that he and his wife got into an argument, she decided to storm off on him, and then mysteriously vanish without a trace. And this particular story seems even less believable than usual, because Maureen's disappearance would have had to take place during a rather narrow time frame. The story goes that Maureen left her house at 8 a.m., but did not show up for work, and her co-workers phoned Paul to mention this at around 8:50 or so. So if Paul is telling the truth, something had to happen to Maureen between 8 o'clock and 8:30. But of course, Paul then instantly arouses suspicion by lying about his attempt to file a missing persons report, when in actuality, all he did was ask police if any accidents took place involving Maureen's vehicle. What's most bizarre is why Paul would even visit the police station to begin with. I mean, I'm not saying there isn't a reason to be concerned about Maureen not showing up for work, but most people aren't instantly going to go running to the police because their spouse is 20 minutes late. If he only wanted to inquire about accidents, that would be one thing, but why make the false claim that you attempted to file a missing persons report? It almost looks like Paul was just putting on a show to make himself look like a concerned husband. I mean, there are just so many red flags to suggest he's responsible. Maureen openly expressing fear that she is afraid of her husband, Paul trying hard to push forward the theory that Maureen ran away voluntarily, a pretty inconsistent, constantly changing story about the last time he saw her, and not to mention Paul trying to get his wife's name off their property and having her declared dead as soon as possible. In all of the interviews I've seen with Paul, he comes off as an unlikable jerk, and law enforcement has openly considered him to be the prime suspect from day one, and would charge him with the crime in a heartbeat if stronger evidence against him surfaced. But then the DNA evidence from Maureen's pantyhose matched up to the sex offender Keith Wayne Holmes, and threw the entire case for a loop. Now, just because the DNA was linked to another suspect does not mean investigators believe Paul is innocent, but this definitely opens up a lot of questions about Keith Wayne Holmes' role in all this. It's entirely possible that Paul hired Holmes to murder his wife, or that they both committed the crime together. The problem is that there's just no evidence to connect the two of them, except for some vague statements that they knew each other from a dementia patient in hospice care, which can hardly be considered reliable. Since it was established that Holmes was camping in Pahrump around the time period Maureen went missing, it seems very likely he was involved. The fact that his DNA was found on a pair of knotted pantyhose suggests that he might have used it to tie Maureen's hands together, but the question is, did he act alone? Well, if Paul's account of what happened is true, and he last saw Maureen leaving their home to go to work, then that means Maureen would have had to cross paths with Holmes sometime between 8 o'clock and 8:30 during her drive to the bank. But how would this have happened? I guess it's possible that if Holmes attempted to flag down a ride that morning, he could have tricked Maureen into pulling over, then forced her to drive out of the area once he entered her vehicle, or he forcibly entered Maureen's car after she pulled over to park at the bank. He then forces Maureen to drive out to a remote area in the Mojave Desert, where he sexually assaults and murders her before disposing of her body. Now we know Holmes was a sex offender, and he apparently had a habit of picking up sex workers, beating them up, and abandoning them by the road, so this could have been a case where things escalated to the point where he wound up killing Maureen. But there's a big problem with this scenario, namely, the fact that Maureen's Hyundai was abandoned in the middle of nowhere. It was parked nearly 120 feet away from the highway in the middle of the barren desert, at least 20 miles outside of Pahrump. So if Holmes forced Maureen to drive there and abandon her vehicle, how did he leave the area? We know the guy owned a Ford camper, but it's not like he could have driven two vehicles out there at the same time. Sure, I guess Holmes could have made it back to the highway and hitchhiked, but this location was in close proximity to Death Valley, which is one of the hottest places on Earth in the daytime. When you couple in the fact that Holmes would need to perform a lot of physical labor in order to hide Maureen's body, there's a huge risk that he's not going to get out of the area alive if he doesn't have transportation. Not to mention that the scene at Maureen's vehicle looks staged in order to give off the impression that she might have wandered off and committed suicide, an explanation that the authorities actually believed at first until they discovered that her empty pill bottle had been wiped clean of fingerprints. Holmes does not strike me as a particularly sophisticated criminal, and if this was just a random stranger abduction, I see no reason for him to go to the trouble of staging the scene like that. No, it seems likely that two people had to be involved. One who could drive Maureen's Hyundai to that remote spot in Inyo County, and another who could provide transportation out of the area. So the most logical explanation is that Paul and Holmes worked to stage the scene together, but I'd be really curious to know how they would have crossed paths in the first place. After all, given that Holmes was a frail old man who was in his mid-70s at that point, he seems like an odd person to enlist as an accomplice to murder. But then again, Pahrump is an unincorporated town in the middle of nowhere, and Paul hadn't lived there that long, so maybe he just had slim pickings to choose from. Since Holmes drove a Ford camper, Paul might have thought it would be the ideal vehicle to transport a body. Even though Paul claimed that he spent the entire evening at home on Valentine's Day, cell phone pings seemed to place him on the other side of town. This strongly indicates Paul is lying, though I wouldn't say it's strong enough evidence to bring criminal charges against him. But if those pings are accurate, then Paul could have been out there disposing of his wife's body. Holmes may have bound Maureen's hands together with her pantyhose, which explains how his DNA got there. He uses his camper to drive Maureen out to the desert while Paul drives his wife's Hyundai. The Hyundai is abandoned over 120 feet from the highway because he wants to ensure that no one will find it until after Maureen fails to show up for work on the morning of February 15th. Paul then stages the scene to make it look like Maureen wandered off, and then he hitches a ride back to Pahrump in Holmes's camper before they go their separate ways. It's worth noting that investigators did find a second set of vehicle tracks near the Hyundai, but since the scene was not properly secured at first, no one could be certain if those tracks were already there when the Hyundai was originally found. Now I know police performed an extensive search of the area where the Hyundai was abandoned and found no trace of Maureen's body, but I have to wonder if she might not have even been buried at the location. Remember, the route from Pahrump to Inyo County is nothing but desert, so theoretically, Paul could have stopped somewhere else to bury her body and abandoned her vehicle at a different spot in order to throw everybody off the track. I'm not sure if any of Paul's DNA was found at the scene, but the problem is that the Hyundai belonged to his wife, and he would have used the vehicle on multiple occasions, so even if his DNA is there, that's hardly incriminating. So it's difficult to pin anything on Paul, but when you break everything down, the most logical explanation is that he and Holmes committed this crime together, and the discovery of Holmes's DNA at the scene does not exonerate Paul in any way. If this is what actually happened, then Paul got really lucky that the DNA match did not occur until after Holmes was suffering from dementia, so any incriminating statements he may have made about Paul cannot be admissible as evidence. So while it might seem unusual that Paul enlisted the help of an elderly man in order to murder his wife, the strategy technically paid off, since Holmes passed away before he had any chance to testify against him. Sadly, until Maureen's body can be found, or other evidence surfaces against Paul, it will be difficult to charge him with anything. At the moment, there is no evidence that Paul and Holmes knew each other, so the presence of another suspect's DNA would be more than enough to generate reasonable doubt if Paul ever went to trial. So if you happen to have any information on the unsolved disappearance of Maureen Fields, please contact the Nye County Sheriff's Office at 775-751-7000. That's 775-751-7000. Anyway, it's now time to move on to our second Valentine's Day cold case, but fair warning, like I mentioned in the intro, this is one of the most disturbing crimes we've ever featured on this podcast, and involves an act of necrophilia. Our second story takes place in Carlsbad, California in 2007. Our central figure is 39-year-old Jodine Serrin, who usually goes by the name Jody. Jody suffers from schizophrenia, but does not let her mental disability prevent her from living a very productive life. She is known for having a very kind heart, devoting much of her time to volunteering and helping others. While Jody is unable to drive and has to rely on the support of her family and friends, she is able to live independently and has spent the past 10 years living in a condo purchased by her parents, Art and Lois Serrin. The couple checked in on their daughter on an almost daily basis, but on this particular Valentine's Day, they were unable to reach her after multiple phone calls. After spending the evening on a Valentine's Day date, Art and Lois decided to go to Jody's condo at around 10 p.m. to make sure she was okay. When they arrived, there was no answer at the door, but since Art had an extra key, he unlocked it. Since the door also had a security chain, Art had to force it open in order to enter the condo. The lights were still on, and all indications seemed to be that Jody was home, but she did not answer when her parents called for her. Art decided to check the bedroom, and when he opened the door, the room was dimly lit, and he was treated to a shocking sight. Jody was lying naked on the bed, and a white, brown-haired, somewhat heavy-set man who appeared to be in his 30s was on top of her. He was partially dressed, and he appeared to be engaged in sexual activity. This was a very awkward situation, and Art believed the man was taking advantage of his daughter, so he told him to put on his pants and get out before closing the door. Art and Lois waited in the living room for the next several minutes and expected Jody to join them after she got dressed, but neither Jody nor the man showed up. Art decided to check the bedroom again and was horrified by his discovery. The man was now gone, but Jody was still lying on the bed, and it was now apparent that she was dead. It would turn out that Jody had been raped, strangled, and severely beaten, and the cause of death was blunt force head wounds. Without even knowing it, Art had come face to face with his daughter's killer, who managed to exit the condo while Jody's parents waited in the living room. Since the front door was not visible from the living room, the man likely managed to sneak outside before the Serrins figured out something was wrong. After police were notified, it was determined that Jody had been dead for several hours before she was found. So yes, the perpetrator had been forcing himself on Jody's body after she was already deceased. 2 other witnesses recalled seeing a man running through some bushes near the condo, and this was likely the killer fleeing the scene. Since there were no signs of forced entry, Jody had probably invited the perpetrator inside before he killed her. Even after he committed the murder, he'd apparently spent hours hanging around inside the condo before the Serrins arrived. The suspect's DNA was collected from the murder scene, but is yet to be matched to anyone in the National DNA Database, so he has never been convicted of a serious crime. But a relatively new process called DNA phenotyping has recently been utilized to create a new composite sketch of the suspect. This process involved combining information from the DNA's genetic profile with Art Serrin's description of the perpetrator in order to come up with a scientifically based computerized image of the suspect's face, or at least what his face would have looked like in 2007. This technology is still relatively new, and no one can be completely certain of its reliability at this point, but it's all they really have to go on right now. Now, there really isn't a lot of analysis to be done about this case, because we know exactly what happened here. The only thing we don't know is the identity of the perpetrator. I have to say, I've read about so many unsolved cold cases and horrific crimes that it's rare that I come across one which truly shocks me, but this was definitely one of them. I first learned about it about 2 years ago while I was compiling a list of unsolved Valentine's Day mysteries for a Listverse article I wrote. After reading the details, I initially thought the killer was raping Jodie when her father walked into the bedroom, but that she was still alive at that time, and the assailant murdered Jodie during the brief window of time when her parents were waiting in the living room before he slipped out of the apartment. That's a pretty awful situation on its own, but once I learned that Jodie was already dead by this point, I was left speechless. I was also surprised that this case wasn't more well known, which is why I felt I had to feature it on this podcast. It takes a special kind of evil to murder a woman with a mental disability, hang around her apartment for hours, and then sexually assault her dead body. And it's pretty terrifying that this guy's DNA is not in the national database, because that means he's still out there somewhere. I have a hard time believing that anyone who is capable of doing something like this has not committed other crimes, so who knows how many other people he's harmed. I would not be surprised if Jodie wasn't his first victim, as committing necrophilia on someone you've murdered is about as extreme as it gets. But the big question is whether or not Jodie knew her killer, as there were no signs of forced entry, so it seems likely she invited him inside the condo. From what I can tell, investigators have never been able to find any solid suspects within Jodie's social circle. Art Serrin did point them towards one person whom he thought may have been the man he saw in Jodie's bedroom, but he was cleared by DNA testing. Sadly, it sounds like Jodie was a very naive and trusting person, which is why her parents checked in on her all the time. You might think it's odd that a father would become angry about discovering a man in bed with his 39-year-old daughter and tell him to get out, but Art probably thought this guy was taking advantage of Jodie's vulnerabilities in order to have sex with her. It's possible the killer was a stranger that Jodie met in public, who convinced her to invite him back to her condo. Or it could be as simple as the perpetrator knocking on Jodie's front door and giving her a convincing enough story that she opened the door and let him inside. You really have to feel awful for Art and Lois Serrin, as it seems they tried so hard to always do what they believed was best for their daughter. On the one hand, they knew Jodie could not completely function on her own, which is why they were so protective, but on the other hand, they wanted her to have some freedom and independence, which is why they purchased her a condo. It sounds like the Serrins did everything right, and Jodie lived life to the fullest in spite of her obstacles. Yet in spite of this, she still wound up crossing paths with a monster, and there's probably nothing her parents could have done to prevent that. The Serrins are both in their 80s now, and it's sad to read that they always have to leave Carlsbad on Valentine's Day every year in order to avoid triggering horrific memories. It's horrible enough when parents have to deal with the murder of their child, but this situation goes to a whole other level. So it would be nice if the Serrins were able to see closure for what happened to Jodie while they're still here, because whoever was responsible needs to be taken off the street. Anyway, if you would like to see the computerized composite sketch of the suspect, there is a website devoted to the case at jodineserrin.net. That's JODINESERRIN.net. There is also currently a $52,000 reward for information leading to an arrest in this case, so if you visit jodineserrin.net, they have an online form you can fill out to submit a tip or provide information to the Carlsbad Police Department's cold case investigative team. Or if you would like to provide information via phone, please call their number at 760-931-2225. That's 760-931-2225. So that wraps up our Valentine's Day double feature episode. If you have your own thoughts about what happened in either of these cases, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. We also have a couple new donors I'd like to thank this week, including Alyssa and Victoria, who has become a recurring monthly donor, so thank you very much, guys. I need to provide my thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. We also have a Facebook discussion group, so if you feel like discussing the podcast or the cases we feature with myself or your fellow listeners, feel free to join, and I'll improve your entry into the group ASAP. I also wanted to mention again that I will be representing The Trail Went Cold by appearing on Podcast Row at CrimeCon, which is being held at the Gaylord Opryland Hotel in Nashville from May 4th to the 6th. So if you're planning to attend CrimeCon, I'd love to have the opportunity to meet you. To purchase tickets to the event, you can visit crimecon.com and receive a 10% discount by entering our promo code TTWC. That's TTWC. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. Anyway, before I close things out, I should mention that it was officially 2 years ago this week that we launched The Trail Went Cold. It's hard to believe the podcast has already been around that long, but this means we're going to be releasing our special 2-year anniversary show next week, where I will be covering a highly requested case which was voted on by you, the listeners. So thanks for 2 years of wonderful support, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new anniversary episode of The Trail Went Cold.